The air was thick with silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city. The bridge, towering over the icy river below, seemed almost deserted at this hour. But there were two figures standing in the shadows. One, an old man, his voice trembling as he spoke, and the other, a younger man with cold, calculating eyes. "I gave you everything," the old man pleaded, his frail hands clutching the edges of his coat as the wind whipped around them. "Why are you doing this?" The younger man didn't flinch. His grip on the old man's shoulder tightened, his jaw clenched as he hissed. "Because everything you gave me wasn't enough." From behind the cover of a rusty guardrail, Barron Trump watched, his small frame hidden in the darkness. He had no business being here tonight. He was supposed to be home, buried in books, but something had drawn him to this bridge. He wasn't sure what. Maybe it was the argument he'd overheard earlier at his father's dinner party. Something about an old man, betrayal, and a fortune. Barron's heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. The younger man's voice grew louder, his words sharp and biting. But the old man's responses were softer now, almost resigned. "You'll regret this," the old man said quietly, his gaze unwavering despite the fear in his eyes. "I already do," the younger man replied, his voice like ice. Before Barron could even process what was happening, the younger man shoved the old man over the edge. The millionaire's scream was short-lived, swallowed by the sound of rushing water below. Barron froze. His mind raced, but his body wouldn't move. The man on the bridge lingered for a moment, looking down at the river as if confirming the job was done. Then, with a quick glance over his shoulder, he disappeared into the shadows. Barron stayed hidden, his breath shallow and his hands gripping the cold metal of the guardrail. He wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but he didn't. He couldn't. As he finally stood, his legs trembling, a thought struck him like lightning. The man hadn't noticed him. No one knew he was there. He was the only one who saw what had happened. And now he was holding a secret that could change everything. Barron's legs felt like jelly as he stumbled away from the guardrail, his breath shaky and uneven. He wanted to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the bridge, but something stopped him. His mind kept replaying the moment, the push, the scream, the splash. Every detail was burned into his memory like a scar. He glanced back at the bridge, half expecting the man to return, but the shadows remained empty. Still, Barron couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His chest tightened as he ducked into the nearby trees, keeping his footsteps as quiet as possible. In the distance, the faint glow of streetlights marked the edge of the city. He just needed to get there, he told himself. Once he was surrounded by people, he'd feel safer. But even as he moved closer, the weight of the secret pressed harder on him. What should he do? Should he tell someone? Could he even explain what he'd seen without putting himself in danger? Lost in thought, Barron didn't notice the sound of footsteps behind him until it was too late. "Hey, kid." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down Barron's spine. He spun around, his heart racing, but the path behind him was empty. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely louder than a whisper. No response. The trees around him swayed in the wind, their branches casting eerie shadows on the ground. Barron clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep moving. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe the night's events were messing with his head. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees, partially hidden by the darkness. Barron's blood ran cold. It was the man from the bridge. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his face obscured by shadows. For a moment, they stared at each other, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Then, without warning, the man took a step forward. Barron bolted. His feet pounded against the ground as he sprinted toward the city lights, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. The trees blurred around him as he ran, his only thought to get as far away as possible. When he finally burst onto the main road, the sight of passing cars brought a wave of relief. He flagged down the first vehicle he saw, a beaten-up truck with a gruff-looking driver behind the wheel. "Please," Barron gasped, barely able to get the words out. "I need help." The driver looked him over, his expression a mix of concern and suspicion. "What's going on, kid? You in some kind of trouble?" Barron hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't tell the truth, not yet. "Not here. I got lost," he lied, his voice trembling. "Can you take me into town?" The driver frowned but nodded, unlocking the passenger door. "Get in." Barron climbed into the truck, his hands shaking as he buckled his seatbelt. As the truck pulled away, he glanced out the window, scanning the trees for any sign of the man. But the road was empty. For now. The truck rattled along the bumpy road, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Barron sat rigid in the passenger seat, his hands clutching the edge of the worn leather seat. His mind raced, replaying the scene at the bridge over and over. The man's face, the old man's scream, the splash. He couldn't shake it, no matter how hard he tried. The driver glanced at him, his gruff demeanor softening slightly. "You sure you're okay, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost." Barron forced a nod, but his throat felt dry. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The driver didn't look convinced but didn't press further. "Where should I drop you off?" Barron thought for a moment. He couldn't go home, not yet. If the man had seen him, if he was being followed, going home would put his family in danger. "Just the nearest diner," he said finally. "I'll figure it out from there." The driver nodded and turned onto a busier road. The sight of neon signs and late-night diners brought Barron a shred of comfort, but it was fleeting. He could still feel the man's presence, like a shadow looming just behind him. The truck slowed to a stop outside a small, dimly lit diner. "Here you go," the driver said. "Take care of yourself, kid." Barron muttered a thank you and climbed out of the truck, his legs shaky as they hit the pavement. He watched the truck pull away before stepping inside the diner. The place was almost empty, save for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and an elderly man nursing a cup of coffee in the corner. Barron slid into a booth near the window, his eyes scanning the parking lot outside. The waitress approached with a notepad in hand. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" "Just water," Barron said quickly, avoiding her gaze. She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, disappearing behind the counter. Barron leaned back in the booth, trying to steady his breathing. He needed to think, to figure out what to do next. But before he could gather his thoughts, the door to the diner creaked open. Barron's stomach dropped as he saw him, the man from the bridge. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest as the man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Barron slouched in his seat, hoping the shadows would hide him. The man didn't seem to notice him at first. He walked to the counter, ordered a coffee, and leaned casually against the counter as he waited. But then his gaze swept across the room and landed on Barron. Their eyes met, and Barron felt a chill run down his spine. The man's expression was calm, almost too calm, as he picked up his coffee and began walking toward Barron's booth. Barron's mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his body refused to cooperate. He was trapped, and the man was closing in fast. "Mind if I sit?" the man asked, his voice smooth but laced with an edge. Barron didn't answer. He couldn't. The man slid into the booth across from him, setting his coffee on the table. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into Barron's. "You saw something you shouldn't have tonight, didn't you?" Barron's mouth went dry. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The man smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Relax, kid. I'm not here to hurt you. At least not yet." Barron swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the man across from him. The casual way the man sipped his coffee made his presence even more unsettling. He seemed too calm, like someone who had nothing to lose or everything to hide. "What do you want?" Barron finally managed to whisper, his voice trembling. The man smirked, setting his cup down with a soft clink. "That depends on you, kid. You're smart enough to keep quiet about what you saw tonight, aren't you?" Barron's hands clenched into fists under the table. I didn't see anything, he lied, his voice firmer this time. The man chuckled, a low, humorless sound. Come on now. Don't insult me. I know you were there. I saw you. His eyes narrowed slightly. And I think you know that sticking your nose where it doesn't belong can be dangerous. Barron's mind raced. He needed to play this carefully. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this man wouldn't hesitate to silence him. I just happened to be passing by, Barron said, trying to keep his tone steady. I don't know anything. I didn't see anything. I swear. The man studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a whisper. Let me make this simple for you. Forget what you saw and we both walk away from this. You go back to your life and I go back to mine. No cops, no questions, no problems. Barron hesitated. Every instinct told him to nod, to agree, to do whatever it took to get out of this alive. But then he thought about the old man, about the way he'd begged for mercy before being thrown into the icy waters below. Could Barron really live with himself if he stayed silent? The man must have sensed his hesitation because his expression darkened. Don't get any ideas, kid, he said sharply. I'm giving you a way out here. Take it. Barron's jaw tightened, anger flickering beneath his fear. You killed him, he said before he could stop himself. The man's eyes narrowed dangerously. Watch your mouth, he hissed. Barron's pulse thundered in his ears, but he forced himself to hold the man's gaze. You threw him off that bridge like he was nothing. Why? Who was he? What did he do to you? The man leaned back, a cold smile playing on his lips. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But you're asking the wrong questions, kid. He picked up his coffee and took another sip, as if they were discussing the weather. The real question is, why should you care? Barron's breath hitched. Because he was a person, he said quietly. He didn't deserve to die like that. For the first time, something flickered in the man's eyes. Something Barron couldn't quite place. Regret? Guilt? Whatever it was, it vanished as quickly as it appeared. You're in over your head, the man said, his tone cold again. He stood, sliding his cup across the table. Consider this your last warning. Keep your mouth shut, or you'll wish you had. Barron watched as the man walked out of the diner, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to breathe a sigh of relief, but he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Barron sat frozen in the booth long after the man had left, his mind spinning with questions and fears. The diner felt quieter now, the hum of the fluorescent lights louder than before. He tried to steady his breathing, but the weight of what had just happened pressed down on him. He glanced out the window, half expecting to see the man waiting in the shadows. But the parking lot was empty, save for a few cars and the faint glow of streetlights. Barron's fingers trembled as he reached for his glass of water. His reflection in the window stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed. He barely recognized himself. Hey, you okay? The waitress's voice startled him, and he nearly knocked over the glass. She stood by his table, concern etched on her face. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, he said quickly, though his voice betrayed him. Just a long night. She didn't look convinced but didn't push further. Well, if you need anything, just holler, she said, walking back behind the counter. Barron took a deep breath, trying to collect his thoughts. The man had warned him to stay quiet, but something about the encounter gnawed at him. The way the man had spoken, the cold indifference in his voice. It wasn't just a random act of violence. There was something bigger at play, and Barron couldn't ignore it. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, his hands still unsteady. Should he call the police? Report what he saw? But the man had seen him, knew who he was. If he went to the cops, it wouldn't take long for the man to find him, and his family. Instead, Barron opened his notes app, typing quickly before he could second-guess himself. Old man thrown off bridge. Suspect. Tall, mid-40s, brown jacket, dark hair. Reason unknown. What was in the bag? He stared at the screen, his mind lingering on the last question. The bag. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it seemed important. What had the old man been holding on to so tightly? And why had the man been so desperate to take it? Barron saved the note and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He couldn't go to the police, not yet, but that didn't mean he could just forget about what he'd seen. He needed to know the truth for himself and for the old man. Pushing himself to his feet, Barron left a crumpled bill on the table and headed for the door. The cold night air hit him like a wave, but it jolted him into focus. He started walking, his steps slow and deliberate. If the man thought Barron was just a scared kid who would back down, he was wrong. Barron didn't know what he was getting himself into, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let this go. The streetlights cast long shadows as he disappeared into the night, his determination growing with each step. Barron's footsteps echoed down the empty street, each step heavy with uncertainty. He didn't know where he was going, but his gut told him to return to the bridge. It was the last place the old man had been alive, and something about it felt like the starting point for answers. The bridge loomed ahead, its iron frame shrouded in mist. The river below churned restlessly, a reminder of the terrible act that had unfolded there just hours ago. Barron hesitated as he reached the edge, his breath visible in the cold night air. He scanned the area, his heart pounding. The faint sound of water rushing below filled his ears. The spot where the old man had been thrown over was eerily quiet, as if the river had swallowed all traces of the tragedy. But then, something caught his eye, a glint of metal on the ground near the railing. Barron crouched down, his fingers brushing against a small, ornate key. It was old, with intricate carvings that hinted at its importance. "What were you hiding?" he whispered to himself, turning the key over in his hand. The sound of an engine rumbled in the distance, and Barron's head shot up. A pair of headlights appeared, growing brighter as a black SUV approached. Panic surged through him. Was it him? Had the man come back? Barron darted to the side of the bridge, pressing himself against the railing to stay hidden. The SUV slowed as it reached the bridge, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. It stopped briefly, the engine idling, before speeding off into the night. Barron exhaled shakily, his pulse racing. He waited a few moments before stepping back onto the bridge, clutching the key tightly. Whoever was in that SUV, they hadn't seen him, or at least they hadn't cared to stop. His thoughts raced as he pocketed the key. What did it unlock? A safe? A box? Something the old man had been protecting? The questions gnawed at him, but he had no answers. Barron decided to retrace his steps, heading toward the nearby park where he'd first spotted the old man earlier that evening. The park was deserted now, the playground empty and the benches covered in frost. He walked slowly, scanning the ground for anything that seemed out of place. And then he saw it. A small leather satchel partially hidden beneath a bush. His breath caught as he approached it. The bag was worn, its edges frayed, but it looked like it had been intentionally tucked away. Barron crouched down and unzipped it carefully. Inside, he found a stack of documents, a bundle of cash, and a photograph. The photo made his stomach drop. It was of the old man, standing with a group of people in front of what looked like a grand estate. Barron flipped it over, and his eyes widened at the scribbled note on the back. "They'll come for me. Protect the truth." Barron's mind reeled. The truth about what? And who were they? A twig snapped behind him and Barron froze. He turned slowly, his heart in his throat, but there was no one there. Only shadows stretching beneath the dim park lights. Still, the feeling of being watched sent a shiver down his spine. He quickly zipped up the bag and slung it over his shoulder. He needed to get out of here. As he stepped out of the park, his resolve hardened. Whatever the old man had been protecting, it was dangerous enough to get him killed. And now Barron had a piece of it. A key, a bag, and a promise scribbled on the back of a photograph. He didn't know who they were, but one thing was certain. They wouldn't stop until they got what they were after. And now Barron was in their way. Barron moved swiftly through the quiet streets, the leather satchel clutched tightly under his arm. His mind raced with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. What had the old man been involved in? What truth had cost him his life? And how deep did this go? He needed answers, but he also needed help. The weight of the satchel and the ominous message on the photograph were too much to carry alone. His first instinct was to call his mother, but he dismissed the idea almost immediately. She would panic, and worse, she might alert someone without meaning to. Instead, Barron thought of his father. Despite the complicated relationship between them, his father was resourceful and shrewd, with connections that stretched beyond what most people could imagine. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it was him. Pulling out his phone, Barron dialed the number he hadn't used in months. The line rang twice before his father's deep, steady voice answered. "Barron?" There was a hint of surprise, but his tone remained composed. "Is everything okay?" "No," Barron said, his voice cracking despite his effort to stay calm. I need your help, but you can't ask questions over the phone. Can we meet somewhere?" There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that carried weight. "Where are you?" Barron gave him the name of a 24-hour diner a few blocks away. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, he added. "I'm on my way," his father replied, and the line went dead. Barron slipped the phone back into his pocket, glancing over his shoulder. The feeling of being watched still lingered, an invisible pressure he couldn't shake. He tightened his grip on the satchel and quickened his pace. The diner came into view, its neon sign flickering faintly. Barron stepped inside, the warm air a welcome relief from the chilly night. He chose a booth in the corner, positioning himself so he could see both the entrance and the windows. Minutes felt like hours as he waited, his knee bouncing with nervous energy. Finally, his father walked through the door, his presence commanding even in casual clothes. He spotted Barron immediately and crossed the room with purpose. "What's going on?" his father asked as he slid into the booth across from him. His eyes scanned Barron's face, taking in the tension and fear. Barron placed the satchel on the table but didn't open it. "Something happened tonight. Something bad. I saw a man kill someone, a millionaire, I think. And now I have this." He tapped the bag lightly, his voice lowering. "It belonged to the man who was killed." His father's expression darkened, the weight of the situation sinking in. "You need to tell me everything, from the beginning," he said, his voice firm but calm. Barron hesitated, then began recounting the events of the evening. The old man on the bridge, the confrontation, the fall, and the cryptic message on the photograph. His father listened intently, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. When Barron finished, his father reached for the bag, unzipping it with deliberate care. He sifted through the contents, his eyes narrowing as he examined the documents and the photograph. "This isn't just about money," his father said finally, his tone grave. "These documents, they're evidence, and dangerous evidence at that." "Evidence of what?" Barron asked, his heart pounding. "Corruption, conspiracies, maybe even murder." His father leaned back, his gaze piercing. "Whoever killed that man won't stop until they get this back. You're in serious danger, Barron." Barron swallowed hard. "What do we do?" His father's lips pressed into a thin line. "First, we need to get somewhere safe. Then we'll figure out what to do with this." He gestured to the satchel. "But you need to understand something. Once we act, there's no going back. Are you ready for that?" Barron nodded, the weight of the moment sinking in. "I don't think we have a choice." As they stood to leave, the bell above the diner door jingled, and Barron froze. A man in a brown jacket stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. It was him. The man in the brown jacket locked eyes with Barron, and for a split second, the world seemed to freeze. Barron's breath hitched, and his fingers instinctively clenched the edge of the table. The man's gaze flicked briefly to the satchel before shifting to Barron's father, as if sizing them up. "Stay calm," his father whispered, his voice so low that only Barron could hear. "Don't look scared. We're leaving now, but don't rush. Follow my lead." Barron nodded subtly, though his legs felt like jelly. His father stood, his movements steady and unhurried, and gestured for Barron to do the same. The man in the brown jacket took a step closer, his expression unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that sent a chill down Barron's spine. As they reached the door, the man spoke. "Leaving so soon?" His tone was casual, almost friendly, but there was an edge to it that made Barron's skin crawl. Barron's father turned slightly, his face a perfect mask of calm. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice steady. The man shrugged. "Depends on what's in the bag." Barron's heart pounded so loudly, he was sure everyone in the diner could hear it. His father didn't flinch. "It's just a few papers. Business matters. Nothing you'd find interesting." The man tilted his head, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I find a lot of things interesting." The tension crackled like static electricity, and Barron's father made the first move. "Come on, Barron," he said, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "We have a long drive ahead of us." They stepped outside, the cold air biting at their faces. Barron's father steered him toward the car parked a few spaces down. "Get in, and don't look back," he murmured. Barron obeyed, sliding into the passenger seat as his father got behind the wheel. The man had followed them outside, standing under the flickering street lamp, his hands stuffed into his pockets. His eyes were on them as they drove away, a dark silhouette in the rearview mirror. "Who is he?" Barron asked, his voice trembling. "Someone who doesn't want us to have this," his father replied, his grip tight on the steering wheel. "And someone we're going to have to outsmart if we want to survive." The car sped through the quiet streets, the satchel now resting on Barron's lap. His father's jaw was set, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of trouble. "Where are we going?" Barron finally asked. "To someone who can help us," his father said. "But first, we need to make sure we're not being followed." They turned onto a series of back roads, weaving through unfamiliar neighborhoods. Barron glanced out the window, his anxiety rising with each turn. Every shadow seemed to move, every car felt like a threat. After nearly half an hour, his father pulled into a dimly lit parking garage. He parked the car in a corner and turned to Barron. "Stay here," he said. "I need to make a call." Barron nodded, clutching the satchel tightly. He watched as his father stepped out of the car, his phone already pressed to his ear. The garage was eerily quiet, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. Suddenly, a sharp noise echoed through the space, a metallic clang, like something being dropped. Barron's head snapped toward the source, his heart racing. "Dad?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. No response. Panic surged as Barron climbed out of the car, the satchel still in his grip. He scanned the garage, his breath visible in the chilly air. "Dad!" A figure emerged from the shadows. A man in a black coat, his face obscured. He was holding something shiny in his hand. Barron took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The man spoke, his voice low and menacing. "You should have stayed out of this, kid." Barron's heart hammered in his chest as the man in the black coat took another step forward. The gleam of a knife reflected in the dim light of the parking garage, its edge sharp and menacing. "Stay back," Barron shouted, his voice trembling, but his fear gave way to a surge of adrenaline. His mind raced, looking for an escape, a way out. But the garage was a maze of concrete and shadows, and the man had him cornered. "Thought you could play this game, huh?" The man's grin was cold and calculating. "You're in way deeper than you know. This doesn't end well for you." He took another step forward, the knife gleaming brighter as he moved closer. Barron's mind spun, but his survival instincts kicked in. His hand tightened around the satchel, not knowing what he could use as a weapon, but desperate to defend himself. He had to do something. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted his father's figure emerging from behind a column. His father's expression was unreadable, but the tension in his stance told Barron that something was about to go down. "Drop the knife, Tony," his father called out, his voice sharp, commanding. Barron's father's tone held no trace of fear, only authority. "You don't want to do this." Tony, the man in the black coat, froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he turned toward Barron's father. I don't take orders from you anymore, old man, Tony sneered, his grip tightening on the knife. Barron's father stepped closer, his posture unshaken. His eyes locked on Tony with a level of coldness that Barron had rarely seen. You're making a mistake, Tony. This isn't about me anymore. You're in over your head. There was a long pause as the two men stared at each other. Barron's mind raced. Was his father bluffing? Could they get out of this? He didn't have much time to think about it. As the silence was shattered by the sound of footsteps behind him, Barron whirled around, panic surging. Another figure emerged from the shadows, a woman this time, her silhouette sharp and distinct. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the scene. She looked like she knew exactly what was going on, and Barron felt a strange sense of unease as she approached them. Tony's expression changed when he saw her. You shouldn't have come, Kara, he muttered, lowering the knife just slightly, but still within reach. This isn't your fight. Kara didn't hesitate. It is now. Her voice was firm, and her eyes were locked onto Tony's. Barron could sense the history between them, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife, almost literally. His father's eyes flicked between the two of them. You two have history, I see. He shifted his gaze back to Tony. You're out of time, Tony. Whatever you're planning, it's over. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The man in the black coat laughed, his laugh dark and hollow. You think I'm scared of you, old man? This is bigger than you. Bigger than all of us. He gestured to Barron. You're both involved now. There's no turning back. Barron felt a chill run down his spine. What had he walked into? The mysteries, the danger, the constant feeling of being watched. It was all escalating, and now he was in deeper than ever before. Before Barron could process any more, Kara moved with surprising speed. In one swift motion, she grabbed the knife from Tony's hand, twisting it out of his grip and knocking him off balance. Tony stumbled back, stunned. But before he could regain his footing, his father stepped forward, his hand gripping Tony's arm with brutal precision. Let's go, his father ordered, his voice low, his grip tight. You've lost, Tony. I'll make sure you regret this. Tony gritted his teeth, his anger flaring, but he knew he was outmatched. His gaze shifted from Barron to his father, then back to Kara. This isn't over, he muttered, barely audible, as he was forced to retreat into the shadows. Barron let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. His heart was still pounding, but the immediate threat had passed. Kara turned to him, her eyes scanning him with something akin to curiosity. You should have stayed out of this, she said, her voice quieter now, almost regretful. You have no idea what you're involved in. Barron nodded, still shaken but determined. I don't know what I'm involved in, but I'm not backing down now. I need answers, and I'm not leaving without them. His father gave him a long, steady look, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. Then let's get to the truth, Barron. But know this, once we go down this path, there's no turning back. And it's going to change everything. The weight of his words sank in as the three of them turned toward the exit of the garage, the heavy silence of what had just happened hanging over them. Barron's mind raced, but one thing was certain. He was in this now, for better or worse. And there was no going back. As they stepped out of the parking garage and into the cold night air, the weight of what had just transpired began to settle in. Barron felt the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. There were so many unanswered questions. Things his father wasn't saying, things Kara wasn't explaining. Where are we going? Barron asked, his voice cutting through the silence. His father didn't answer immediately, his face still etched with the same unreadable expression. It was only when they reached the car, parked near the edge of the street, that he spoke. We need to lay low for a while. I'm taking you somewhere safe. Barron nodded, but inside, his mind was racing. Safe? He didn't feel safe. Not after what had just happened. Not after everything he'd learned in the past few days. Kara had already climbed into the back seat, her eyes distant, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Barron took the passenger seat, still unsure of who he could trust. His father started the car, the engine purring softly in the night. Listen, Barron, you've been dragged into something much bigger than you know. What happened tonight, it's just the beginning. We've been keeping secrets from you, but it's time you learned the truth. Barron's heart skipped a beat. What truth? What are you talking about? His father glanced at him, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and determination. The world you think you know? It's not the one you've been living in. And Tony? He's just a small part of a much bigger game. Barron's head spun. A bigger game? What game? And why had they kept him in the dark for so long? You're not telling me everything? Barron said, his voice rising with frustration. What's going on? Who is Tony, and what does he want with me? His father sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's complicated. I never wanted you to get involved, Barron. But you're already too deep now. We can't protect you forever. Kara's voice broke through the tension in the car. He has a right to know, she said, her tone softer than before but still firm. It's not fair to keep him in the dark. His father glanced at her, then back at Barron. All right, you want the truth? You're part of something bigger, something dangerous. You've been targeted by people who want to use you. They've been watching you, studying you. And Tony? He's working for them. Barron's mind was reeling. Targeted? By who? Why me? Because you're the key, his father said, his voice low, his gaze never leaving the road. You've got something they want. Something we've kept hidden for a long time. Barron felt a shiver run down his spine. What do I have? What could they possibly want with me? His father fell silent for a moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, he spoke again, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. I can't explain it all right now, but you need to understand that everything that's happening, it's connected to you. And it's about to get a lot more dangerous. If we don't act quickly, it's not just you they'll come after. They'll go after everyone you care about. The words hung in the air, thick with fear and uncertainty. Barron's mind struggled to process the implications. Kara's voice interrupted the silence. You need to trust him, Barron. This is bigger than anything you've ever imagined. And if you don't start listening, it's going to cost you more than you're willing to pay. Barron looked between his father and Kara, his heart pounding. He didn't know who to trust, but one thing was certain. They were all in danger now. We need to get to the safe house, his father muttered, turning down a narrow street. And we need to do it fast. As they drove further into the night, Barron's thoughts swirled with confusion, fear, and a growing sense of dread. Whatever was coming, it was only going to get worse from here. And there was no turning back now.